My son's therapist was torturing him. The school's camera was broken. The phone call that shattered my world came on a Wednesday, a day so painfully ordinary it now seems like a cruel joke. I was at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet, my mind a million miles away, when a number from my son Elijah's Autism Therapy Center flashed on the screen. My heart did a familiar little lurch of paternal anxiety, but I assumed it was a routine call, a question about billing, a reminder about a schedule change. The voice on the other end, however, was not routine. It was the center's director, Mrs. Wilson, and her voice was a high, tight wire of panic. "Mr. Garner," she said, her words rushed. "You need to get here immediately. Elijah is choking." The world went silent. The numbers on my spreadsheet blurred into an incomprehensible scrawl. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember the frantic, white-knuckled drive across town. My entire existence was reduced to a single, primal, and all-consuming fear. By the time I screeched into the center's parking lot, the ambulance was already there, its lights a silent, strobing testament to the severity of the situation. They were loading him in, my small, beautiful 8-year-old son, his body limp on the gurney, a tube snaking down his throat. His therapist, a young woman named Miss Lexi, rushed over to me, her face a mask of practiced, professional concern. "He choked on his snack during break time," she explained, her voice a little too calm, a little too rehearsed. "We performed the Heimlich, but he was still struggling to breathe, so we called 911 as a precaution. But I hadn't packed any snacks for him that day. He had a specific, medically supervised diet, a fact that was clearly and repeatedly documented in his file. A small, cold, and deeply unsettling detail. During the frantic, siren-screaming ride to the hospital, the situation became even more terrifyingly inexplicable. The paramedics confirmed his throat was clear. The obstruction, whatever it had been, was gone. But he wasn't getting better. His face, his beautiful, perfect face, was a horrifying shade of blue and purple. His brain, they told me, their voices a mixture of professional detachment and a dawning, human confusion, was shutting down from a profound lack of oxygen. This shouldn't be happening. One of them kept muttering, his eyes fixed on the heart monitor, its frantic, irregular beeping the soundtrack to my own personal apocalypse. At the hospital, it was a blur of controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses descended upon him, a whirlwind of scrubs and urgent, coded language, and he was rushed to the back, disappearing behind a set of swinging double doors that felt as final and impassable as the gates of hell. I was left alone in a sterile, silent waiting room. The next 4 hours a slow, agonizing eternity of pacing, of praying, of my mind replaying every moment of my son's short, precious life. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was a grim, exhausted mask. He told me that my son, my vibrant, beautiful boy, was on life support, his small body kept alive only by the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of a ventilator. I stumbled forward, my arms outstretched, an instinctual, desperate need for human comfort, for a shared moment of grief. But the doctor took a sharp, almost violent, step backward, his expression shifting from one of professional sympathy to one of cold, hard, and deeply unsettling suspicion. His eyes, which had been so kind just moments before, were now like chips of ice. "Mr. Garner," he said, his voice now a low, accusatory growl, "is there anything you need to confess?" I stared at him, my mind unable to process the question. Confess? Confess to what? It took me an hour of desperate, tearful pleading, an hour of my own world collapsing, to convince him that I had no idea what he was talking about, that I was just a terrified father whose son was dying for a reason no one could explain. That's when he pulled out the X-ray. He clipped it to the light box on the wall, and the image that glowed there was a new, and even more terrifying, level of horror. There, scattered throughout the delicate, branching architecture of my son's lungs, were dozens of small, gray, and unmistakably foreign objects. "It's foam," the doctor said, his voice a flat, clinical monotone. "Gray, industrial-grade foam. The kind used for soundproofing." He pointed to a section of the X-ray, his finger tracing the ghostly outlines. "And the craziest part," he added, his voice now a mixture of medical curiosity and a dawning, human horror, "is that some of this foam, based on the tissue scarring around it, looks to be weeks, maybe even months old. Something had been happening at that therapy center. Something dark, something secret, something that was now, quite literally, suffocating my child." That night, as I sat by Elijah's bedside, a silent, helpless vigil in the hushed, beeping world of the ICU, my phone rang. It was our insurance company. The woman on the other end, her voice a symphony of practiced, insincere sympathy, informed me that, due to the specific terms of our plan, they could only cover 72 hours of life support. 72 hours. The only way, she explained, her voice a calm, bureaucratic drone that they could extend this coverage would be if I could provide immediate, irrefutable proof of foul play. And, she added, with a chilling, almost accusatory addendum, proof that I had not deliberately caused the injury for the purpose of an insurance payout. The sheer, monstrous cruelty of the insinuation, the idea that I, a father watching his child die, could be capable of such a thing, was a fresh, twisting knife in my already bleeding heart. I tried to argue, to plead, to reason, but it was like talking to a machine. The next morning, I drove straight to the therapy center, my grief now sharpened into a cold, hard point of rage. I found Miss Lexi in her classroom, her back to me, cheerfully arranging a set of colorful plastic blocks on a shelf. Why was there foam in my son's lungs? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous growl that I didn't recognize as my own. Her face, when she turned to me, went from a bright, professional smile to a mask of pure, unadulterated panic in a split second. She backed away from me, her hands held up in a defensive gesture, her body pressing against the wall as if she could somehow melt into it. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. Sometimes the sensory toys, they break. This wasn't sensory toy foam, Lexi, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the industrial foam that was lodged in my son's lungs. This was soundproofing foam, and it's been happening for months. She stuttered something about needing to speak to the director, about having an urgent meeting, and then she practically fled from the room, leaving me standing there in a classroom that now felt less like a place of healing and more like a crime scene. As I was leaving, a woman, another parent I recognized from the morning drop-off, a woman named Jennifer, stopped me in the parking lot. Her own face was a mask of worried concern. Is Elijah okay? She asked, her voice a hushed, nervous whisper. My son, Billy, he told me something yesterday. She glanced around the parking lot, as if she were afraid of being overheard. Billy says that Miss Lexi, she brings foam blocks in her bag. She takes some of the kids, the ones who stim a lot, into the back room with her. The quiet room. My face went white. My Elijah, my sweet, nonverbal boy, he rocked and he hummed. It was his way of self-soothing, of navigating a world that was often too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. Billy says he hears crying from that room. Jennifer continued, her own voice now trembling. And then the crying stops. But the kids, they don't come out for another 20 minutes. I felt a wave of nausea, so profound it made the world tilt on its axis. Another parent, a man named Robert, a father I had often exchanged tired, knowing nods with, overheard our conversation and joined us, his own face a mask of dawning horror. My son, Max, he said, his voice a low, angry growl. He came home gagging last week. Miss Lexi told us he just ate his snack too fast. But Max told me he never got a snack that day. He's been refusing to come to therapy ever since. He won't tell me why. He just screams and screams. The pieces of the puzzle, the horrifying, unthinkable puzzle, were beginning to snap into place. I stormed back into the center, my fear and grief now a righteous, all-consuming fury. I bypassed the front desk and marched straight into Mrs. Wilson's office. I want to see the security footage from the quiet room. I demanded, my voice a command, not a request. Now, Mrs. Wilson, the director, a woman with a perfectly coiffed helmet of hair and a smile that never quite reached her cold, dead eyes, just folded her hands on her desk, a picture of calm, bureaucratic authority. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Garner, she said, her voice a smooth, placating drone. That particular camera has been broken. For months. How convenient. I spat, the words a bitter, sarcastic poison in my mouth. The one room where Miss Lexi takes our children and does God knows what to them. And the camera is broken. Mrs. Wilson's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing. Miss Lexi is our most experienced and respected therapist, Mr. Garner. I think you are overreacting to what was, in all likelihood, a very unfortunate but entirely accidental incident. Accident. I roared, my last shred of control finally snapping. There is old, scarred-over foam in my son's lungs. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. She stood up then, her own voice now a low, menacing hiss. Without any proof, Mr. Garner, all you have is a wild, unsubstantiated accusation. Your son ate some foam. Children like him, they aren't always the brightest, are they? Perhaps you should take a closer look at your own parenting. Maybe you'll find a pattern there. She then, with a dismissive wave of her hand, told me to leave her office before she was forced to call security. I drove the 90 minutes to the state licensing board in a blind, white-hot rage. But the woman at the front desk, a bored-looking bureaucrat with a stack of paperwork in front of her, just barely looked up at me. You'll need to file a formal complaint online, she said, her voice a monotone of pure indifference. You'll receive a response in 6 to 8 weeks. My son has 3 days, I told her, my voice trembling with a desperate, impotent fury. 3 days until his insurance company pulls the plug on his life support. That sounds like a matter for law enforcement, she said. And then her eyes went back to her paperwork, a clear and final dismissal. And so I drove the 90 minutes back to my own town, back to the local police station. But Mrs. Wilson, ever the strategist, had gotten there first. I saw her walking out of the station as I was walking in, a smug, triumphant grin on her face. The officer at the front desk, the very same one she had just been speaking to, looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "We know what you're doing here, Mr. Garner," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. "We've been briefed on the situation, and I would kindly suggest that you leave, right now, before we are forced to put you in handcuffs for professional harassment and child endangerment." My jaw dropped. She had not only beaten me there, but she had managed to completely flip the script to cast me, the terrified, grieving father, as the villain. As I walked back to my car, a sense of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over me. The school, the state, the law, every system that was supposed to protect my child had not only failed but had actively and aggressively sided with his abusers. And in that moment, I knew, with a chilling, absolute certainty, that if I was going to save my son, if I was going to get justice for what had been done to him and to all those other children, I could no longer play by their rules. I called my best friend, Jacob, a brilliant and slightly ruthless law student who was home on spring break. "I need a favor," I said, my voice a low, dangerous calm that I didn't recognize as my own. "I need you to scare the truth out of her." That evening, we arrived at Miss Lexi's quaint, suburban house. Jacob, dressed in his best and only suit, a briefcase in his hand, looked every bit the part of a high-powered, cutthroat attorney. The color drained from Miss Lexi's face when she opened the door and saw us standing there. "Miss Lexi," Jacob began, his voice a smooth, confident purr that was pure, beautiful performance. "I represent the Garner family, and I think we need to discuss your options before formal, and I do mean very serious, criminal charges are filed." We stepped into her house, and the carefully constructed facade of her life, and her lies, began to crumble. Miss Lexi's knees seemed to buckle beneath her. "CRI criminal charges?" she stammered, her voice a thin, reedy sound that was a world away from the confident, professional tone she used at the center. She collapsed onto her plush, beige sofa, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass of water on the coffee table. Jacob didn't even acknowledge her question. He just continued, his voice a calm, relentless, and terrifyingly official-sounding monologue. He began to speak in a dense, almost incomprehensible, legal jargon, throwing around terms like felony child endangerment, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and violation of state and federal disability protection statutes. He painted a vivid and entirely plausible picture of a long, brutal, and very public legal battle, a battle that would not only end her career, but would also, he noted with a casual, almost offhand cruelty, likely result in a minimum of 25 years in a state penitentiary. 25 years, minimum, he repeated, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. That was the phrase that finally and completely broke her. She started sobbing, a raw, ugly, and deeply satisfying sound, her body curling into a tight, fetal ball on the expensive sofa. "Please," she whimpered, the word a muffled, desperate plea. "Please don't." Jacob, a natural predator who had just scented blood in the water, pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I have the district attorney on speed dial," he said, his voice now a low, dangerous purr. "Or," he added, his tone shifting to one of almost gentle reason, you can tell me, right now, exactly what you have been doing to those children." She collapsed more fully onto the living room carpet then, her body shaking with a series of violent, uncontrollable sobs. She rocked back and forth, a strange, rhythmic motion that was a horrifying, almost obscene echo of the very same self-soothing stim that my own son used when he was stressed. "They made us do it," she finally managed to choke out, her voice so quiet, so broken, that I had to lean forward to hear her. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, our state funding, it all depends on our behavior reduction metrics." She said nothing else was working fast enough to meet the state's requirements before the quarterly review. Jacob, his own phone now discreetly recording, moved closer to her, a silent, encouraging presence. The story came pouring out of her then, a torrent of poison and shame and a desperate, self-serving need for absolution. She described something she called the quiet mouth protocol, a term so euphemistic, so chillingly bureaucratic, that it made the bile rise in my throat. She explained how they would take small, torn-off pieces of the industrial soundproofing foam from the storage room and push them into the mouths of the children who hummed or made other vocal stems during their therapy sessions. The first few times, she confessed, the children would spit the foam out immediately. So, they had to get creative. They had developed a technique they called calming holds, a grotesque, Orwellian term for a two-person restraint, where one therapist would hold the child from behind, their arms wrapped tightly around the child's small, struggling body, while the other forced the foam deeper into their throats, all while whispering, "Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet." I wanted to throw up. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach out and throttle this woman, this monster who was now weeping on her expensive rug. But I forced myself to stay still, to let Jacob, my brilliant, ruthless friend, continue his interrogation. We needed every single, sordid, and damning detail on that recording. She admitted that this protocol had been in place for 8 long months. It had started with the children who stymied the most, the ones like my Elijah, who rocked and hummed, the ones whose disruptive behaviors the state reviewers would be most likely to notice during their quarterly and apparently all-important on-site visits. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely operate her own phone, but she managed to scroll through her text messages, her tears dripping onto the screen. She turned the phone towards us, and there it was in stark, undeniable black and white. A long, horrifying thread of text from Mrs. Wilson, a digital transcript of her conspiracy of abuse, with timestamps going back months. Make them quiet, by any means necessary. I don't care how you do it, just get results before the review. The board is watching our behavior reduction rates. Do whatever it takes. Jacob, his own face a mask of cold, hard fury, began taking pictures of her screen with his own phone, meticulously capturing every single message. Miss Lexi, now in a state of complete and total collapse, kept sobbing that she never meant for anyone to get really hurt, that Mrs. Wilson had told her the phone was safe, that it would just dissolve. She rambled on about a workshop Mrs. Wilson had sent them to, a workshop on behavior suppression techniques, where the presenter had demonstrated the foam method on a mannequin. She gave us the names of 2 other therapists who were also using the protocol. She gave us the names of 12 other children, 12 other victims, names I recognized with a sickening, dawning horror from the center. We had it all. The confession, the text, the names. We left her house, a house that now seemed tainted, and I practically ran to my car. I drove straight to the hospital, a new and far more powerful kind of hope blooming in my chest. At the ICU, I found Megan Bennett, the hospital's head social worker, a woman I had been told was a force of nature, a fierce and tireless advocate for her patients. I played her the recording. She listened, her face growing paler and more horrified with each passing second. Before the recording had even finished, she was on the phone, her voice a calm, professional, and utterly commanding force. She called the state child protection hotline, bypassing the local and clearly compromised police department entirely. She called the Attorney General's office. She alerted the hospital's risk management team. And then she looked at me, her eyes filled with a righteous and deeply reassuring fury. "Don't you worry, Mr. Garner," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "We're going to burn them to the ground." The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of official and deeply satisfying action. Megan, my newfound and ferocious ally, quarterbacked the entire operation with the skill and precision of a seasoned general. The hospital's risk management team, now in a full-blown panic about their own potential liability, immediately began to pull the medical records of every child who had ever been a patient at the therapy center. They were looking for a pattern, for other cases of unexplained respiratory distress, of accidental ingestion, of diagnoses that now, in the light of Miss Lexi's confession, looked suspicious. I in turn began my own, more personal investigation. I sat in the hospital cafeteria, a grim, makeshift command center, and I started calling the parents of the other children Miss Lexi had named. Most of my calls went to voicemail, but within a few hours, the callback started to come in as slow, then steady, and then overwhelming torrent of stories that mirror my own. A mother whose daughter had suddenly and inexplicably stopped talking after starting sessions with Miss Lexi. A father whose son had been coughing up weird, gray stuff for weeks, a symptom his pediatrician had dismissed as a symptom of severe allergies. Jennifer, the mother from the parking lot, showed up at the hospital with a manila folder thick with her own meticulous documentation. She had calendars where she had marked every single time her son, Billy, had come home and mentioned the quiet room. She had even saved a series of his crayon drawings, strange, disturbing images of children with what she had thought were just blocks in their mouths. The dates on the drawings, we realized with a dawning, sickening horror, corresponded with the dates that Elijah had come home from therapy, unusually quiet and withdrawn. Robert's wife arrived an hour later, her own arms filled with a stack of medical records. She showed me photos on her phone of her son Max's throat, taken a month prior. It was red and raw, covered in small, angry-looking scratches, injuries the doctor had blamed on a severe case of acid reflux. Their insurance had even paid for a costly and invasive endoscopy, a procedure that had found significant irritation, but no obvious cause. Now we knew the cause. Now we knew the truth. In the midst of this flurry of a grassroots investigation, I received a call from Gabriella, the woman from my insurance company. Her tone, which had been so cold and bureaucratic just the day before, was now a mixture of genuine shock and a new, almost fawning level of helpfulness. They had reviewed the initial evidence packet that Megan had sent over, and they were granting us a 24-hour extension on Elijah's life support coverage while their own special investigations unit looked into the matter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a lifeline. Armed with this new, if temporary, reprieve, I took Elijah's x-rays and the foam samples to a specialist, a renowned pulmonologist named Dr. Arthur Hess, a man Megan had described as a god in his field. Dr. Hess, a tall, thin man with a quiet, scholarly air, spent 2 hours meticulously examining everything, his brow furrowed in a deep and deeply concerning concentration. His final report was a 6-page, single-spaced, and utterly damning document. The foam patterns, he wrote, were absolutely not consistent with accidental ingestion. The placement, the depth, the scarring on the surrounding lung tissue, it all pointed to a single, horrifying conclusion. The foam had been forcibly and repeatedly inserted over a period of months. The next morning, Gideon Armstrong, the lead investigator from the Attorney General's office, arrived at my house. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man who radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable competence. We spent 3 hours on my kitchen table, going through every piece of evidence, every parent statement, every medical report. He made copies of everything, his portable scanner a quiet, worrying testament to the official and now unstoppable nature of the investigation he was leading. That same afternoon, Ivy Rollins, the journalist from the Disability Rights magazine, published her first story. It was a bombshell, a meticulously researched and deeply damning exposé that laid out the entire, horrifying story of the quiet mouth protocol. She had even, through a public records request, uncovered the purchase order for the industrial soundproofing foam, signed by Mrs. Wilson herself, and an email from the supplier explicitly warning that the foam contained chemicals that could cause severe respiratory damage if ingested. The story went viral. The state licensing board, which had so dismissively told me to file a complaint online, was now in a full-blown panic. State investigators, armed with a search warrant, raided the therapy center, carrying out boxes of files, computers, and a binder they found hidden in Mrs. Wilson's locked desk drawer, a binder that was labeled, with a chilling bureaucratic neatness, Quiet Mouth Protocol. Inside were the detailed, step-by-step instructions for their program of systematic abuse. Mrs. Wilson was arrested that afternoon, her smug, confident facade crumbling as she was led out of the center in handcuffs. The insurance company, now facing a massive, multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit from 23 different families, approved continued, indefinite coverage for Elijah's care. Miss Lexi, in exchange for her testimony, took a plea deal for lesser charges. The 2 other therapists she had named, seeing the writing on the wall, had already quit and fled the state. Mrs. Wilson's trial began 3 months later. It was a short, brutal, and deeply satisfying affair. Miss Lexi, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of guilt, took the stand and told the jury everything. Another therapist, a young woman who had quit 6 months prior after refusing to participate in the protocol, testified about Mrs. Wilson's threats, her obsession with quotas, her casual, dehumanizing references to the children in her care as defective products. The jury took less than 4 hours to find Mrs. Wilson guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence that felt woefully inadequate but was, at the very least, a public and legal acknowledgement of her crimes. 2 weeks after the verdict, I finally brought Elijah home. He was a different child, of course, the trauma of the past few months having left its indelible mark. He was still on a feeding tube, his speech was gone, and his body was weak and frail. But he was alive. He was home, and that was all that mattered. I quit my job to become his full-time caregiver. Our days now a relentless and exhausting schedule of therapies and medical appointments. The therapy center, its name now synonymous with a horrific national scandal, was sold to pay for the massive lawsuit settlements. A group of the parents, led by the indomitable Jennifer, bought the building and transformed it into a new, nonprofit center, a place founded on the principles of acceptance and neurodiversity, a place with cameras in every room and an open-door policy for parents. The state legislature, spurred by the public outrage Ivy's articles had generated, passed a new law, a law they called Elijah's Law, that mandated cameras in all therapy rooms and established a new, more rigorous, and entirely independent system of surprise inspections. A year after the nightmare began, I was helping Elijah with his morning routine, a slow, patient process of getting him dressed and ready for his new, wonderful, and inclusive school. He looked up at me, his eyes, which had for so long been distant and full of a pain he couldn't articulate, were now clear and bright. He reached out his small, thin hand and touched my face. "Dad," he said, the word clear and perfect and the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My throat got tight, and I pulled him into a hug, my own tears of joy so profound it was almost painful, soaking into his hair. We have both been scarred by what happened in that center. He carries the physical scars in his lungs, a persistent, rattling cough that still sometimes wakes him in the night. I carry the emotional scars of a father who didn't see, who didn't protect, who almost lost everything. But we are here, we are fighting, and we are healing, together.